All right.
Okay.
So we are live. Welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. I'm Alex Howlett. I host these things. Today, the topic is minimum wage. Some of us read an article from businessinsider.com called "The Supply and Demand Model of Labor Markets is Fundamentally Broken, and That's Why You're Not Getting a Pay Raise Anytime Soon" by Jim Edwards. And if Bethany were here, she'd be giving me some flack for selecting this article because it really made her frustrated. She thought it was not a very well-written article and did not address points very well. So I've been getting some flack at home for choosing this article. But nevertheless, I thought it covered a broad range of things related to minimum wage, where we could bring up basic income as a contrast. So I want to start with a very simple question this week, which is minimum wage good? Why or why not?
Me.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't read the whole article, I have to admit. Is minimum wage good? I mean, superficially, yes. It seems like it would be good. From the worker's point of view. From the bigger picture, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether it would be good. I mean, that article did point out the fact that the unemployment rate, for example, is affected by so many contractors and gig economy people, and that also affects the idea of minimum wage, in my mind. If you're setting a minimum wage, is it only for people who work in a certain kind of way, in a full-time job, that's structured a certain way? What about the people who, Uber and Lyft and those people? Does that affect them? As they come in and out of the economy, it seems like it would be unstable. But that's my only takeaway. But I think I've always thought a minimum wage would be good. People, deserve more money than they get usually.
Okay.
Yep.
Nick.
Yeah, maybe I'll pass. I didn't get a chance to read the article. I think, to me, I don't have a strong view kind of in an absolute sense, but I think it depends on I think we're probably going to wind up talking about basic income. I definitely think basic income makes a lot more sense. If you have to choose one, definitely choose basic income.
Right.
But I think so I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah.
Hey, Katie.
Hi, Katie.
Elizabeth.
My instinctive answer is still a yes, minimum wage is good. I've been listening to you for years, so I'm like slightly less strongly instinctive about that than I used to be. To Nick's point, like a guaranteed basic income that pays, that people can live on is probably preferable to a minimum wage. But in the absence of that, I feel like paying people more money feels like a good thing. I mean, to Joan's point, I would imagine a minimum wage in this hypothetical as everyone gets paid $15 an hour or whatever, that you are not legally allowed to pay people less than that, whether they're wait staff or gig economy or whatever. That it's and I mean, you can maybe nuance that about cost of living in different places or something, but basically be you can't pay people less than this with appropriate carve outs for you can pay your teenage babysitter less than that, but not stupid carve outs. They're but wait staff will make it up in tips, and so it's fine that you pay them $2 an hour.
That's a great example.
I recognize that there are other problematics with minimum wage, but you're going to bring those up later, so I'm just going to...
Richard, what do you think?
Well, what happens to the people who already make $15 an hour before the pay raise? When I was a paralegal, I earned $15 an hour. So would I earn $20 an hour? $25? And would that lead to stagflation or something? Because the wages keep rising and rising and rising.
It's an interesting question. Katie, we're asking people whether they think minimum wage is a good thing, why or why not.
I'll pass for now.
Okay.
Just settling in.
Yeah. So yeah, this is an interesting question for me, and I think the answer is different depending on kind of what level of the system we're looking at. So if we imagine an economy that's functioning correctly, when I imagine an economy that's functioning correctly, I imagine that there's a basic income as a part of this economy that's calibrated to the productive capacity of the economy so that markets can be efficient, and the only purpose of wages is to incentivize people to work. So that's kind of like my baseline kind of default model of how the economy should work. Now, if you remove the basic income, it causes all kinds of problems. And then we kind of have to put these things in place to deal with these problems. And, some things, we deal with better than others. For example, if there was a basic income, maybe we wouldn't have had like financial crisis in 2008 or something like that. And I don't know what the answer to that is besides putting the basic income in place. But something like a minimum wage where your goal is to supply consumers with income. I mean, if you don't have a basic income, then you need other ways to supply consumers with income, even if they're insufficient. You need to figure out some kind of patchwork of something. So we have minimum wage, we have, economic policy that creates jobs and stimulates the labor market as a way of getting income to consumers, and then we also have various welfare programs in place as a way of getting incomes to people, and kind of all this stuff. Which if we just removed it, everyone would be worse off. Like we wouldn't end up in a better world. So if you say should we end minimum wage right now, I'd say absolutely not. But it's still, to me, it feels like a symptom of the fact that something is broken, and kind of like a Band-Aid over kind of like a serious defect in the economy. So Rick Stefanowski says, not a strong opinion, but corporate bureaucracy is broken. So without a minimum wage, corporations will push their workers in a race to the bottom. If you don't pay your workers less, your competitors will, and outcompete against you, in certain industries at least. So, I mean, I think that intuition is right. So, if you decide to pay your workers more, you're at a competitive disadvantage. But if there's a minimum wage in place, then everyone has to pay their workers more, and it levels the playing field. So the businesses can still be okay. Yeah.
Well,
Richard.
I've read that there's lower turnover in places that pay more. So, and it costs more to keep retraining workers over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's right. So I think, in the case of an individual business, if they're operating efficiently, which not all of them are, but there are some businesses for whom, the best decision is to pay their workers more to avoid those kinds of problems. And then there are other businesses where if they want to maximize their profit, it's still worth it for them to pay their workers less because maybe it's a really simple job and the training isn't that hard, and if they lose another worker, they can just replace that worker, that kind of thing. So I don't know that I would say that minimum wage would kind of force businesses to make decisions that are better for the business themselves, like all else being equal. I don't think that's the case. I think the businesses that profit from paying their workers more are already paying their workers more. Yeah, for the most part.
So I didn't read the article, so I don't know when it came into place, minimum wage. Or why?
It doesn't say that in the article.
Oh, okay.
But I think
it's like 1935 or something.
Yeah, I think that's about right. During the
time.
Depression, that kind of time frame.
Yeah.
I think that sounds right. Elizabeth can look it up for us.
So
yeah,
was it?
well, I was trying to remember, like, because wasn't it originally supposed to be like intended as a living wage, like that the minimum wage was supposed to be like if you as a head of household work 40 hours a week, like that you can support like a family on that. Yeah, so it dates like Fair Labor Standards. It was introduced in 1938.
Okay. Yeah, and certainly
Kind of the result of the Depression.
Yeah, one of these measures that was kind of like in the New Deal era, trying to get us
trying to stabilize the worker more than the economy, right?
Yeah, so like President Roosevelt in 1933 says, "It seems to me to be equally plain that no business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right
Yeah.
to continue in this country."
Okay, part of the social
Yeah.
programs. Okay.
And it's interesting too because, you know, back then and even today, you know, we think of people as workers and we think of, you know, I like to say people don't need jobs, they need money. But if jobs are the way you get money, then they need jobs.
Right.
And if the jobs aren't paying enough, then you need them to pay more.
Right.
And then something like a minimum wage starts to make a lot of sense. But, you know, even if you had minimum wage, you know, applied to Uber drivers or something like that, what if you only drive a couple hours a week? You know, you make $30, say $15 minimum wage. You make $30. That's not a minimum income for you. It's a minimum wage in terms of like your hourly.
No, it's not a living wage. I mean, you can't live on $30.
It's a living wage, but it's not a living income, right? Like the wage it would be a living wage if you know, extrapolate it to a full, you know, a full-time job's, you know, worth of work.
If you did.
Right.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't do that.
So I think this article talks a little bit about how people are doing a lot of part-time work and minimum wage is the way to help them. And I'm not so sure about that. Like if you're not getting enough hours, then the minimum hourly rate is not what's going to help you get enough income. Yeah, I mean it'll help you get more than if the income were lower, if the wage were lower, but it's not, you know, it's not the answer. So Mitchell says, if you had a minimum universal basic income, would you need a minimum wage? And I would say no. I would say that you know, the fact that we have, well, it depends. If you have a universal basic income that's calibrated to the productive capacity of the economy, so that you are getting consumer spending up to the level that the economy can sustain, then almost by definition, you're providing people with the maximum benefit that they can possibly receive from the productive economy. So in that case, you wouldn't need a minimum wage because the primary mechanism by which we get income to consumers is the basic income. And then that can allow the labor market to not be concerned with providing consumers with incomes or doing anything for kind of workers. It can be concerned with, well, how do you allocate labor for the purpose of production for the benefit of consumers? And some of those consumers happen to be workers, but that's not what gives them their identity as people. So yeah, hey Bethany.
Hey, sorry I'm late.
So we started with a question, and the question was, is minimum wage good? Why or why not?
Good.
Is it good?
It's exactly
Not a good question.
It's not a good question?
No, okay, sorry.
Okay.
It's just a compliment.
Or under what contexts? And,
Right,
you know,
right,
like
right,
you can expand on that.
Oh man, I don't really know my answer to that question. I can think of, well, yeah. I mean, I think one thing that this article kind of danced around or sort of made the point of is that, like, without good bargaining power, minimum wage sort of tries to compensate for workers not having much bargaining power. And I don't know enough about its costs and benefits to actually really say under what conditions that's worth it or not for the sort of, if you take the population as a whole. I guess I just really feel like I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
But, you know, we talk a lot about, and I'm sure you've already made this point before I got here, about like with the basic income, you can have a more elegant system because people can have bargaining power and the free markets can operate without what I assume are some of the costs imposed by basic minimum wage.
Yeah.
So, for example, like people not being able to make essentially trades that they want to make. So one way to look at minimum wage is like you're not allowing certain people to make certain trades they would otherwise want to make. Not that's the only way to look at it, but I guess you get around that with giving people bargaining power in a different way.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because basic income does give people bargaining power. It gives workers bargaining power in terms of negotiating their wages. But it's also, we don't care, under a basic income, we won't necessarily care about workers having bargaining power for the same reasons that we care about now. because in today's economy, we care about workers having bargaining power because we want them to get treated fairly by the worker.
Well, I guess I would
be able
slightly
to
disagree with that. I don't think
No.
I'm really disagreeing with you,
Okay.
but I guess I would say like the ability to not take a job is bargaining power. Like
Sure.
if you're forced, we don't want people to be forced to be in like bad jobs, say with horrible work. Like I'm not really sure.
Right. The ability not to take a job is part of bargaining power.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I don't understand what you mean by saying that we wouldn't care about workers' bargaining power with the basic income.
I'm saying if the basic income is in place, we don't necessarily. It doesn't necessarily matter to us whether a particular worker can haggle for a particular, pay increase or something at their job or something like that.
No, not that narrow version of bargaining power, maybe, but I guess
Yeah.
I would say, like, if, say, the basic income was really, really low and people were still forced to take jobs and then those jobs had, like, horrible health conditions or something. I mean, like, I guess I just wouldn't make such a blanket statement about not caring about workers' bargaining power.
Yeah, I mean, I think basic income gives people, by and large, a lot more freedom.
Right.
And that includes the freedom to decide whether they want to be workers or not, the freedom to decide whether
Right.
they want to work at a particular job or not.
It does depend on the level, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on the level.
But it's not like a binary thing where you get to some level and then suddenly there's more bargaining power. It's more like as the basic income increases, the bargaining power also increases.
Yeah,
Right.
that's true. I think your point about pay, I agree with. Like if people's pay can come from other places, like a basic income, then we don't necessarily care about the ability to negotiate for a higher salary as much.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think I definitely emphasize the whole freedom aspect of basic income. By withholding the money from people, you're unnecessarily restricting their freedom. But if you let them have the basic income, then people can have more freedom to spend their time how they choose. And obviously, as Nick pointed out, it depends on the level. The higher the basic income, the more freedom. Yeah.
But I do think it seems to me that there's some kind of threshold that you cross. I mean, it's not
For
either or,
For-
but I mean there are basic incomes that are high enough that you can subsist on
Right.
just the basic income.
I was sort of thinking that through too.
And then there's, you could easily imagine a basic income that was too low for that to be true, and then people do have to.
Yeah, I was
job.
thinking
So-
about that tipping point.
So I think that's right, but I still don't think it's a tipping point because it's as the basic income increases, that increases the number of jobs you can afford to take. So it does gradually increase your freedom. Even if you have to take some job somewhere, it might not be the crappy job you had to take when there was no basic income. You know what I mean? So maybe before you couldn't afford to work for less than $30,000 a year. But now you can afford to work for $20,000 a year,
So your
and you can
bargaining
take
power
it.
has still gone up.
Your bargaining power has gone up, and you can take a job that maybe pays less but is more enjoyable activity for you, that kind of thing. So it's always going to be this gradual thing. And then in terms of what's needed to subsist on, that depends on a lot of factors too. It's not the same for everyone. It's different for people living in different areas. So maybe a small basic income that isn't enough to subsist where you're living now is enough so that you can move somewhere else and not have to have a job or that kind of thing. So I don't think there's a tipping point.
I think too that the basic income puts the power in whatever power there is in the hands of the consumer or the worker. And I'm now thinking maybe it shouldn't replace minimum wage because minimum wage is really brakes on the employer, not. I mean, it's a way of keeping everybody. It's kind of like improving working conditions in mills or something. If you don't have regulations to do that, then there's, as somebody said earlier, there's a drive to the bottom. There's a drive to cutting all kinds of corners, and that would be true whether there was a basic income or not. That minimum wage kind of keeps corporations and labor markets at a certain level. Because they have that drive to profit.
Sure.
So one thing that I'm thinking about as a possible counterpoint to that or downside is like your level of basic income might have to be lower if you had a minimum wage for maybe multiple reasons, but the following reasons. So we often talk about how people had a high enough basic income, some jobs would pay more, like the less desirable jobs, because people have more bargaining power. But some jobs would pay less because maybe people pretty much already want to teach yoga, but they only
Yep.
really are going to do it if they get
Right.
paid just like a little bit, or they really do kind of want to tutor that kid.
Right. Mhm.
So you're now saying that can't happen. So you're kind of cutting off the part of the distribution where the wages would get cheaper,
Right.
which means that
Right.
you're going to have more inflation more easily
Mhm.
because you're only seeing the part where the wages get steeper
Right.
because of the bargaining power, and not the part where the wages get cheaper. And so as a
Wages
result, you
get
actually
cheaper?
can't.
Or-
Yeah, like the yoga teaching thing or the tutoring thing, where it's a desirable thing. So like with a basic
Right.
income,
Right, right.
when people have more
right. So
freedom,
they
they have
get
more
paid
time,
less,
they're
yeah.
willing to do it for less.
Right.
If you disallow that, then you're actually not allowing for that compensation for the wages that are getting higher.
So
We disallow
something you
it,
can,
though. Minimum wage would disallow.
Well, isn't minimum wage exactly that? Like it's saying you can't pay a wage below this.
right.
That's what minimum
So
wage is.
So
we-
you could pay a wage above it.
You could pay a
Well,
wage
that's my
above
point.
it,
So
right?
then
Yeah.
there's
So-
inflation more
Right.
easily with
If we imagine a
income.
basic income is in place, then since that gives more people to choose their job, then you would imagine that the more desirable jobs, like jobs that people would want to work, start paying less, and the jobs that people don't want to work start paying more because you have to pay people more to get them to do those jobs.
Right.
And the jobs that people might really want to do might be things that they really would spend their time doing and maybe even be happy to spend their time doing for free. So the thing I like to remind myself of, or remind you guys of, is that we have volunteer work, and that's something that's socially acceptable.
Right.
And then we have minimum wage work, and that's something that's socially acceptable. But then there's a whole continuum in between of possibilities that are illegal, that we're not allowed to do.
Right.
So maybe people,
Illegal?
yeah, because you're not allowed to pay
minimum
below
wage.
minimum wage.
Oh.
So I could
Right.
volunteer to tutor your kid, but
Right.
I can't get paid
Right, right,
$3
right.
an hour to tutor.
Right,
Right.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, the question is, yeah, the minimum wage forces wages to be above a certain point, but why would you want to do that? Like, why do you care about wages being above a certain point? You know, the jobs aren't the main way that people get their incomes in this scenario, right? Yeah.
I mean, I think that's only true if it's at a pretty high level, and like maybe that's kind of one way to think about if there are threshold effects. Like, is that true? That basic income is the main way most people get.
So I don't know if that's the case. I think there's a certain capacity of the economy to produce stuff for consumers, and there's no way to kind of trick it into producing more. So if you are in an economy that's so resource constrained that the basic income is very low, then you can't force the economy to to use resources or to provide things that it doesn't have the capacity to provide. So then what would the benefit of a minimum wage be in that context? Right?
I mean, one extreme of that is as the basic income level sort of goes to zero.
Sure.
Right, and so it's sort of like saying, what is the benefit of minimum wage? And I think it's to avoid this kind of like race to the bottom.
Well, if you can imagine an economy in which the optimal basic income is zero, then you have a situation in which there's no extra resources to give out to people. So you're also in a situation where, everybody's work is kind of needed at the rate that it's being paid. Like there's no slack. There's no
key difference between like the optimal level being zero in Alex's theory and like our current situation is that he would say our current situation is one with the optimal level being quite high, and so there really is a need for people to have money, like spending money that they can spend to activate the economy. Like if you give people more money, we can actually produce more stuff. And so we kind of force people that money through the labor market through things like minimum wage, partly because we're not, but there's room for that money to go somewhere productively. Whereas if the optimal level of basic income was zero, according to Alex's scheme, labor would be your constraining resource. You would desperately need everybody's work and other things like that. I mean, you presumably are just in a poor situation.
Yeah.
I'm still not sure I'm putting all the pieces together.
Wondering if you could imagine a situation in which you kind of needed everybody's work, but then there was someone who had all the power and was able to get everyone to work and, get most of the benefit for themselves, that kind of thing.
Right.
Then I think you're in a situation where you'd need some kind of mechanism to free up those resources from that person.
Right.
You're talking about Jeff Bezos now?
No, I'm imagining like an Egyptian pharaoh or something. Yeah, but whatever. Yeah, same thing. Yeah. So,
Right.
and then the question is, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah.
And you could do that. You could try to accomplish that by forcing this pharaoh to pay people a minimum wage, or you could
Tax and
Taxing.
redistribute.
you could do it by taxing those resources to free them up, and now you can afford to pay
Give people
basic income. Yeah,
Right.
and I think the basic income is the
Yeah.
more flexible route.
Maybe
It
that's like, is
gives
it
more
another way
freedom.
to,
Yeah.
let me try something out, because
Yeah.
I'm trying to put this together in my head. Is another way to think about it that like, every amount that you could afford to pay people as a minimum wage that they could then spend productively, you could also just pay them as like a basic income.
Right. We
make
kind of,
sense?
with the minimum wage, we kind of frame it as the companies being the ones paying for it, and with basic income, we often think of as the government being the one paying for it. But in the end, what matters is whether the economy has the capacity to
Right.
respond productively to that spending.
Yeah. So like if
Yeah.
if the economy can respond to an increase in minimum wage of say like $2 an hour or something that works out to $10 a day for people, let's say, then like I think according
Then it
to
can
Alex's
also
scheme,
respond
it could
to a
just
basic
give them
income.
$10 a day as
Yeah.
as a basic income.
Of the same amount. Yeah.
Yeah, there's also
Yeah,
the
Richard.
job guarantee and the wage subsidy from that presentation a few months ago.
Yeah, or in Cass.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so this guy, Orrin Cass, who I went to high school with and was the domestic policy director on the 2012 Mitt Romney campaign, he has an idea for wage subsidies where you pay employers, the government pays employers to pay their employees more. So, I mean, it's kind of an elegant, interesting solution, but it's also thinking about people as workers and the way that they should get their income is
Right.
through jobs, and then you're still kind of restricting people's freedom in this way. So we got a few comments on the live
Yeah.
stream. Rick says, how do you address companies like Walmart siphoning funds out of local economies not being addressed by UBI solutions? So I would say that UBI basic income does address this. And the idea is that if Walmart is able to sell things to consumers in these economies, then you can give a stream of income to the consumers, and then they can spend that and buy stuff from Walmart. So if you imagine, there's consumers who want all these things that make them happy, and Walmart is supplying these things, and there's a flow of money going from consumers to Walmart and a flow of products and services, et cetera, going to consumers, then that's exactly how you'd want the economy to work. You want people to be getting the stuff from Walmart, and Walmart is incentivized to do that because they can make profit by siphoning funds, as you say. But as long as we have a basic income, there's more funds to siphon, and everybody wins. So I would say that's actually, you don't want to prevent that. That's how the economy should work. Do you guys have any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, siphoning funds in what way? I think he might be talking about, mom and pop stores and people that are going out of business because Walmart came in and
Sure.
is taking money from the economy that would go to them, so they go out of business.
Sure, but is that a problem either, right? Because ultimately what we care about is the consumer. We care about the people, right? We care about the people receiving a benefit. We want the people to benefit from the
People who run
economy.
those stores too.
There are people who run those stores, but do
Yeah.
we really want people to be running stores that aren't needed? Like, this is the perfect example of something I would call an unnecessary or useless job. If you're running a mom and pop store that sells a smaller subset of the same stuff at higher
Walmart
prices
does.
than Walmart. Yeah, these are jobs we don't need. Yeah.
One of the
Yeah.
things that Bernie Sanders complains about is that places like Walmart pay so little that the government is forced to pay them like food stamps and things like that.
And that's such an interesting complaint. And I hear Bernie Sanders kind of go on about this. And it's funny because it's really this idea that it's on the employer to kind of take care of people. It's people have to have jobs, and then your employer takes care of you. But that's not the job of businesses, right? The job of businesses isn't to take care of employees. It's the job of government to represent the interests of the people. So it's a little bit weird that I don't know. I kind of see it as, it's the government's job to make sure that everyone has an income. And then by blaming employers for not paying their employees enough, or by, forcing employers to pay their employers more through minimum wage, they're essentially foisting their own responsibility onto private businesses.
Well, that goes back to what Elizabeth was saying about the Depression and when this all started. I mean, it started because people needed a higher wage, a stable wage to live.
People needed a higher income.
Yes.
And they didn't have this concept that income and wage don't have to be the same thing, right? So I mean, if they had instituted a basic income, that would have also solved the problem, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're thinking about it then. Were they thinking about it?
Well,
back
some
then?
people are always thinking about
Yeah.
it, but it wasn't the mainstream thing, and
Right.
it's still not. But yeah. So we were talking about. So Richard mentioned. He was talking about the Bernie Sanders thing where Walmart employees had to be on food stamps, and Bernie Sanders kind of characterizes this as a bad thing, that it's bad that the government is supporting people, right? But this is exactly how we should want the economy to work. We want the government to be making sure that everyone's okay, and then it gives employers and employees more freedom to choose, how much, the wages are and what's needed to incentivize the work, and then the labor market can be more efficient. Like this is we want to go more in that direction. We shouldn't complain about the fact that the government is subsidizing Walmart employees or providing people with the stuff they need. We need more of that. We need to go more in that direction because we have the resources to do that, right? There's no reason why we shouldn't. So it's we have this kind of moral judgment of employers like Walmart. And even Walmart kind of falls into this because they like to brag about how good they are to their employees and how many jobs they create and stuff like that. So it's not like Walmart is totally innocent here. Like they're playing into the same narratives in their marketing and all of that.
Right.
But if they just said, hey, it's not up to us to pay our employees a certain amount, I would kind of respect that a little bit more.
The way it ties into the article is that they were talking about how we expect people to work more so that they can earn more and pay for themselves or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that people need to kind of support themselves, or be self-sufficient in the context of a market economy or in the context of like trading their labor and supplying their labor, and they get what their labor is worth and that kind of thing. It's very ingrained in our culture.
Right. And yet, we're already denying that with something like a minimum wage. So it's a weird double thing. You're supposed to support yourself, but we're going to force people to say that your labor is worth more than it actually
Well, and a lot
is.
of people
Which is strange.
do have
Not
judgment
that,
about not minimum wage, but welfare and
Yeah.
food stamps. And there are
Yeah,
people in rural
definitely.
areas or otherwise that just won't do it. They don't want to do it. They're too proud to do it. They think it's morally reprehensible to take something that they haven't earned. So it is ingrained in our culture. In our
But the funny
country.
thing is, if you're using economic policy to force money to people through the labor market, can we really say that that's something that the person earned either?
I mean, I think the whole thing is silly. Like, I think that. Sorry, did I?
No, go ahead.
I think. We sort of end up then thinking somehow that we're equating a person's value or even how much they're contributing to society with like the market value in dollars of that thing, which are not actually connected very well.
Right.
A lot of the time.
Market value and human value are two very, very different things.
But that's not. I mean, most people are not. They're wedded to that idea of working and their identity being as a worker.
They are in some contexts, but there are plenty of parents who stay at home and don't have a job, and their spouse goes off to work.
They don't think of it as work.
Right. So depending on the context, they might be attached to this idea, but then in other contexts, they're not. So some of the most valuable work that people do is work that's not paid because it's valuable to society, but it's also so valuable to the person doing the work that they're willing to do it without being paid.
Right.
Like being a parent, right? That's really important work, but it's important to the worker too.
Right.
This is like
So
a
you
missing
wouldn't pay
dimension
it.
in most people's thinking, I think. There's like that affects the market value is how much people are willing to do it without the money.
Right.
Like that also really affects the market
does.
value. And people, I think, don't think about that piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd expect the work that people really want to do to be paid the least, and the work
Right.
that people don't want to do to be paid the most.
Right.
If there's no basic income and everybody's starving, then people are desperate to do any kind of
anything.
work,
Right.
even if it's terrible work.
Right.
So
That's
that's something that basic income can help fix.
Yeah.
So Rick has really asked a couple of
Yeah.
questions about the difference between, like the gap between rich and poor changing with the basic income, which
Yeah.
we've talked about before, but I don't know if you want to address in this context.
Yeah. So first he says, wouldn't UBI empower large multinational companies to increase the speed of increasing rich-poor gap? Doesn't spending habits need to change, or a change to buying from decentralized organizations? I'm not sure I fully understand this question. I think, an important thing to keep in mind is that money and freedom and power are not like a one-to-one thing. There's no amount of taking away money from the rich that will empower people as much as ensuring people have a basic income. Like a small amount of money going to the poor makes so much more of a difference than taking a large amount of money from the richest people.
But you could take enough away from the rich so that they can't influence elections by paying off politicians and things.
I don't think you can. I think if you tried to take that amount away from the rich, you'd break market incentives. So now, the people behind Walmart and Amazon wouldn't have a reason to run their businesses anymore because their businesses can't profit, right? So then kind of everybody loses. Everybody's poorer because they're not able to buy their amazing goods and services anymore.
So you take it away from the rich by taxing them and giving it to the poor, do the Robin Hood thing, and then the poor would be spending into the economy, so you wouldn't really be breaking anything.
Well, you would, because since you're breaking the incentives for the companies to produce things for everyone, now you're reducing the productive capacity of the economy.
Breaking the incentives.
Yeah, so the idea
because
is
of not getting enough profit.
Yeah.
Not getting enough profit, right?
No, that's just capitalism at work.
Well, I mean,
That's
it's the way markets work, right? So markets are very sensitive to these kinds of things, and you actually don't have to tax Walmart very much to run them out of business, right? It's
Because the profit margins are so low on like grocery stores and things.
Yeah. And it's not the case that you can just take money from one part of the economy and put that money in another part of the economy. There has to be room for that money in the other part of the economy. So a lot of people think you're trying to balance taxation and government spending, but in order for the government to spend money and give money to consumers, there needs to be productive capacity to respond to that consumer spending. There needs to be something for those consumers to buy with the money. So that's true whether you happen to be taxing the rich or not.
So you're saying taking money away from the rich would reduce the productive capacity because...
I'm saying it depends, right? So if certain rich people are using up resources that could be going toward consumer goods that consumers really need, then you can tax the use of those resources to free them up. And that can actually increase the amount of basic income you can afford. But taxing, something I like to say is that money is the wrong thing to tax. You want to, that sounds weird because when you're taxing, you're taking money. But it's not like you look at some amount of money and you say, that's a certain amount of money, we're going to take that money and put it over here, because that's not how money works. You can't just take money from one place and put it in another place. But you can say, look at all these resources that are being wasted over here. We're going to punish that activity through a tax to disincentivize it. Now that frees up resources for other parts of the economy. Now you can afford a higher basic income, right?
Yeah, what's an example of resources that would be taxed? I mean,
like that Wood Mountain example you used before.
So that's not a realistic example.
Like if you don't have a lot of water in a state, then filling up your swimming pool a million times a season.
You could tax excess use of water,
So
to free up water for everyone else.
Basically, or profligate use of
No,
things.
you don't necessarily want to tax all greed, because there's some greed that is not wasteful of resources, right? So there are plenty of ways rich people can show off and waste money and that kinds of things that are not going to negatively impact other people.
Steer the greed towards the
luxury
things that
liners.
don't hurt anybody else.
Right. Like an example is like buying a $10,000 bottle of champagne and having the
Right.
bartender pour it down the sink.
Right.
Right.
That's obviously extremely greedy and wasteful, and they're showing off and all of that.
Right.
But all you've wasted is one bottle of champagne
Right.
in terms of like the real actual
Right.
waste. So we would want to direct rich people's kind of like wealth signaling and stuff like that towards wasteful activities that aren't actually wasteful to the rest of the economy.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually, that can be quite easy to do in the sense that, like, a lot of times these things are fungible because the goal for the individual wealthy person can be just mostly to show their
Mhm.
wealth, which you
Yeah.
can do in any
Right.
number of different ways,
Right.
just by doing something that other people can't afford.
Right.
Like jewelry is another example. Fancy
Yep.
jewelry. But yeah, I think the short answer, just to Rick's point, is like it doesn't address the amount of dollars in the hands of basic income. Doesn't address the amount of dollars in the hands of wealthy versus poor people.
Right.
But Alex was just giving a lot of reasons that he doesn't think that's the primary concern, or still thinks that basic income is worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I would say that basic income solves the problem of how to get money to consumers. And the market economy is not going to function properly unless consumers have spending money. So we try to do all these other things like minimum wage and other things related to the labor market to force incomes to consumers, but it's really inefficient. So basic income solves that problem. It does not solve the problem of rich people being really, really, really rich. And if you want to solve that problem, I think that's a really complicated thing, but it's kind of a separate issue. I don't know, once we have a basic income in place and we calibrate it to the productive capacity of the economy, are we going to look around and say, oh, maybe it's okay that billionaires are billionaires or something like that? I don't know, but certainly there's this idea in our society that poor people are poor because rich people are rich. And when you kind of take that away, I'm not sure how much of a problem we'll think of rich people being rich as.
We did have a discussion on this. I don't
Yeah.
know if
Yeah.
you could point him to where that would be, like on YouTube or whatever.
We had a discussion in one of our previous discussions.
Inequality.
We had one on inequality, and we've had one on
Poverty.
and we've had one on maybe power. I don't know.
I was thinking
there's
of the
multiple.
inequality one.
The inequality
Yeah.
one. So yeah, you could check that one
We
out,
talked
Rick.
about some of these nuances and stuff. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, to Richard's point, disproportionate influence in politics. I still think it's true that giving the poor people more freedom to spend their time how they choose and be civically engaged is going to make a much bigger impact than kind of taking money away from the rich people. And you can also regulate how money is allowed to influence politics and stuff like that. I think that kind of stuff can be really effective. I don't know how much you can really accomplish by taking away money from rich people, unless you really want to go to the point where you're distorting markets and causing problems in the economy that are worse for everyone.
I kind of wonder
Yeah.
about that though sometimes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess I just don't know.
I mean, I don't know. I think it's really complicated.
It is complicated.
Yeah.
Has anyone brought up my particular gripe about this article? I guess it's not that important.
I brought up at the beginning that you were giving me a hard time about choosing this article.
Why,
Yeah.
Bethany?
Well,
Why?
I felt that it was like people reading this are as likely to be like more confused as they are to be like more clear. I kind of felt like it was going for like a clickbaity thing, and it sort of obfuscated the true message a little bit. And so what I mean by that is like it doesn't seem like the general theoretical relationship between sort of the amount of employment and thus the amount of bargaining power and wages is really any different. It's just that the unemployment numbers are not really capturing
Right.
that picture
That seems to
because
be what it was
people
about,
are
yeah.
employed, but they're employed
Yeah.
part-time, and so
Right.
actually there's a lot more room for them to still do more work, and that's what reduces their bargaining power because the company can go to somebody else who has a lot more room to do more work. So they're not really fully employed.
Right.
So I don't
Right.
know.
So
He didn't-
it's not that the supply and demand model of
Right.
labor
Yeah.
is broken.
It
Yeah.
has nothing
Yeah.
to do with the gig
Yeah.
economy, except that that's a way in which people can look employed and not be fully using up all of their time. you
Right.
know?
Yeah, that is a misleading headline. that's
So I
for
thought
sure.
it was a
Yeah.
little bit misleading.
Yeah.
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 And yeah, I didn't read the whole article, but the part I read didn't really relate to that.
He gets to it
supply
later.
and demand
It's a
model
quote.
of
It's
labor
actually a quote from.
fundamentally
In fact, he
broken.
really explains how the supply and demand model of labor is still operating just the way they always said it was, but
Right.
the unemployment numbers don't capture it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I think. Yeah.
So I don't know. I guess that's not that relevant, but I kind of.
Yeah.
Just need to vent your frustration about it.
I just wanted to take out my frustration. Thanks for listening.
Uh,
Get back to the discussion.
I'll-
Exactly.
I'll get to more Rick's points, but does anyone else have anything they want to say before I do?
I mean, I guess
Yeah.
I'm trying to think about. I don't know if we want to explore like minimum wage, in different kinds of scenarios. Like, I guess I just don't really understand. Like I said at the beginning, whether like what its general pros and cons are in the economy.
Well, I
fully.
think waitressing is a great example of minimum wage being good, having to have it so that people don't depend on tips, actually. I mean, that kind of fluctuation, I was a waitress for a lot of times. I was very bad at it. But,
Yeah.
But the
Was
idea
it like
that
26 jobs in 1 year?
a lot of jobs as a waitress because you could get them easily then. You
Yeah.
walk in and you get a uniform,
Yeah.
and then you walk out,
Right.
have a free lunch. But the tip was so variable, and so you were so dependent on them because they paid so little.
Right.
Yeah.
I forget what it was, but it was very little. You could possibly live on it. So it was really about the tips.
Yeah.
Put you in a weird position, not just being a service person, but really becoming this kind of catering person.
Right.
And as a woman, it was really uncomfortable having to do that. The smiling bit, and all of that was horrible. So I think if there were minimum wage for waitressing, that would be a great thing. I mean, yes, basic income would help, but I still think a minimum wage for waitressing would be desirable because then you wouldn't have to depend on those tips.
But do you think? But then wouldn't people just walk out? Like if you have like a livable basic income?
Yes.
Because that's Alex's schema.
Yeah.
Is
Wouldn't
a,
they-
Is a
you
like
mean-
okay.
wouldn't
So
they
then
walk
like
out?
if you're like like if someone's being a jerk,
Yeah.
if I'm getting.
Yeah, that's
It's
what
like-
I did. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then I lost my money.
So
Yeah.
that's like so if you have enough money to
Right.
live on, like you would only be waitressing if it was worth it. To you.
Right.
So,
So-
yeah. Either you were like, I just really love waitressing. I think
Yeah.
like catcalling is
Or-
just kind of a fun part of my day.
Or
Like, whatever.
employers. I mean, there would have to be a better environment.
Right,
That
so
was
one of
created,
those
less
two-
of a
Yeah, so-
hostile environment.
Well-
Yeah, so then like employers would choose
yeah.
how much they pay
Yes.
or the working conditions.
Yep.
Right.
Independent, like there wouldn't have to be a mandated minimum wage.
Exactly.
Like, wow, in order for like women to put up with this shit from
Yeah.
like dude bros who are just getting a cup of coffee and like sitting here for 4 hours, like we actually have to pay these waitresses like $50 an hour.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
In,
Yeah, Richard.
in Europe, particularly in Germany, they have something called Trinkgeld, which is
What are they called?
drink, which is a drink,
Yeah.
and it's 20% of whatever the purchase is, which is like a tip. Well, in the U.S., they say if you want to be generous, you do 20% of the shipping.
Yes.
They automatically have it by law. They do
Oh, yeah.
20% of it,
Yeah, some places do
and
that.
so you don't have to actually
Right.
tip. It's already included
Yeah,
in the
some
bill.
places do that. In America, I mean.
I think you're saying it's the law there.
Yeah. Oh, there's
Yeah.
a law there.
Yeah.
That's just kind of
So-
like a funny way to do the wage then, though,
Yeah.
where it depends on how much people order and stuff
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, and it's a tricky thing. I liked Elizabeth's comment about just enjoying being a waitress and being
Yeah,
treated
I
that
was
way
going
and
to
stuff
highlight
like
that
that.
again too.
And it's an important point because if you have a basic income, right? If you have a high enough basic income, then all of the people who hate being waitresses are going to quit,
Oh yeah.
Right.
and
Right.
the people who loved being waitresses anyway are no longer having to compete with all these people who are desperate for that job.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah, that's
And there
true.
already are like
I don't think there'll be
robots
enough
that-
waitresses.
that deliver food. Like there's a sushi bar that has a conveyor belt type thing, and there's this
Yeah.
robot in like Pakistan that brings out the food. It's
Mhm.
like the major draw to have people come and see the robot deliver their food to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Hello, my name is. I'd like that. I'd like a
I don't
robot.
think you'd ever have to worry about there not being enough waitresses because the labor market is a market. So if you need more waitresses, you can offer a higher wage.
Right. That's
Right.
sort of the whole
Right.
point about
Yeah.
bargaining
Yeah.
power and
Right.
stuff.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of deflated
Right.
it now because people like have to have some
Right.
job, and
Right.
so like.
And if
yeah,
nobody
they can
wants to
walk
work for
away.
tips, you can
Yeah.
say, okay, we're not doing that anymore.
Right.
Right.
So you don't necessarily need a minimum wage in place to get these benefits
Right.
because the workers
Right.
now have bargaining power,
Yeah.
as Bethany
And
said.
they're forced to give you more money.
Yeah, otherwise you wouldn't do it.
Right.
You're only going to be working there if it's actually better than not working there.
Right.
So sometimes I like to ask, what's wrong with the economy that working at Walmart is better than the alternative of not working at Walmart? Like we all talk about how terrible working at Walmart is,
Yeah.
but the reality is we live in a world where if you didn't work at Walmart, you'd be even worse off.
Yeah.
Right.
So
You might
that's
pay
the
your
problem.
rent,
That's the
you might not
inherent
have
problem.
food. Yeah.
Right. The problem isn't how Walmart treats their employees. The problem is
Yeah.
how we treat people who aren't working at Walmart, who
Right.
aren't employees of
Right.
anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I liked your point and your point too, Elizabeth, about allocating like people's interests and talents a little bit better to right? Because now, I mean, it will just shift that a little bit more so that people have more freedom, so they're more likely to go after the jobs that they want to go after, which are probably the jobs that they're like a little bit better suited to too. Some people are better, like you might, for many reasons, not even in addition to it being not a great job for most people, like maybe it was really not a great job for you. You know,
I wasn't good at it. No.
You know, but if you had an income where you could spend time writing or do something else,
Yeah.
you know, you'd leave
Yeah.
that to somebody else, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that can be good for the consumer too, is I guess what I'm pointing out.
Well, it's the kind of job that you can get easily too. I mean,
Right.
that's part of all of this. That the people who don't have enough education or wherewithal to get
Right.
a job that's better than that,
Yeah.
like Walmart, that's what they've got.
But
you know?
that's just a version of bargaining power. So
Yeah.
I like kind of putting it on the same spectrum. It's like more people would become like that in a way, because like the reason it matters
become
that you.
able to.
So the reason that you're
not
better off
work
when you
there.
have like a specialized skill is like there aren't that many people with that specialized
Right,
skill,
yep.
and so then you have some bargaining power.
Right,
Like they
yeah,
can't just go to
exactly.
infinite other people. So then you're treated better. You don't usually need it. You're
Do you think
usually you're above
universal
minimum
basic
wage.
income would take the place of that, though? I mean,
I don't think it
there'd
would
still
take
be
the place
people
of
with
that. Yeah,
specialized skills.
of course, you could still have even more bargaining power. But I guess
Yeah.
what I'm trying to say is like what naturally you can look at the direction bargaining power goes by looking at what naturally happens with people with more bargaining power now.
Mhm.
They don't get minimum wage, they get more than minimum wage.
Right.
You know, and they get other kinds of benefits, and
Right.
they don't take any old job that isn't respectful or whatever.
Yeah, the people
You
who
know.
have bargaining power have it a different way. I mean,
Right.
they have more education. Or they
Yeah,
have,
I think
or
that
they're
would
living
still
in a
be there,
place.
but then you just have like, I guess it's a raising the floor bargaining power kind of thing,
Right.
where like nobody would have the, and it is almost like a really dramatic thing. No one would have the lack of bargaining power where they're going to starve or be on the street
Right.
without.
But some people would
that
always
job.
have more bargaining.
Of course, yeah. It doesn't really equalize it.
Right.
just
And
because it's
yeah, and I just want to emphasize again that it's important where the bargaining power comes from. The
Right.
bargaining power comes from the fact that people are better off by default.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
So
Right.
the bargaining power is not kind of. I mean, the bargaining power is an effect of everyone being better off.
Right.
And you know, you can kind of see that everyone's better off because they're able to bargain and all that kind of
Right.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to emphasize that. Yeah. Go ahead, Nick.
This is, I think it overlaps, but it's maybe a different way of looking at this question of, you know, if there was like in a world where we were giving people as much basic income as we could,
Yeah.
it's a little bit like the yoga instructor example, but I think we haven't really talked about looking at it from the point of view of an objection that people raise, which is about a future where there are a lot of people who aren't working a regular full-time career track job, whether that's because of basic income or because of robots taking away our jobs. I think we've talked about before the worry that people won't have meaning in their lives, or they won't have anything productive to do. And I think that I think the logic for me that makes it seem clear that in a world with a basic income, you might not want to have minimum wage is the kind of blurring of the boundaries between work and volunteering or activism or like other kinds of
Right.
efforts.
Right.
And that, I mean, you can even imagine, you know, let's say we get to the point where, you know, everybody's really kind of bored because they're sick of just like watching TV and going in VR world. Like they want to do something. They might actually, you could imagine an entrepreneur setting up some kind of activity that
Right.
benefits the community and is so satisfying and fun that people will pay to go
Right.
and be in that factory making the cool stuff.
Right. Right. Right.
We already have something like that.
What's that?
School. It's a job that you pay in order to do the work.
Right.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, it's not quite his point because you have to do that school to get a job later, which is part of why you're doing it.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, exactly. No, I think that's right. And like when something that reminds me of is like when it's been more stigmatized for women to work, like they did a lot of like volunteer work and that kind of thing, partly because it's rewarding to do that and for other motives, right?
Yeah, what did you mean about blurring the boundaries, between minimum wage and universal basic income and volunteer work?
Like the Andrew Yang has that social currency or whatever.
Freedom dividend.
No, the digital social credits.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Not a lot. Yeah,
Oh,
he's
okay.
not playing that up these days.
Oh, by doing meaningful work in the society.
He has like
you
a
get
point system where you
credits?
reward people for doing
Oh.
socially beneficial activities,
Oh,
that
okay.
kind of thing.
So that's what you mean, that all those things
Mm-mm.
would be kind of equal in the same.
Yeah, or the there could be organizations that were kind of on a continuum
Right.
between
Exactly. Yeah.
right.
like just organizing volunteers to do
Right,
something,
right.
to do something good versus
Right.
producing a product that people will pay for.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. So
Mhm.
there could be like, and another thing I took from what you were saying, Nick, is like we really strongly conceptualize like your paid job as something somehow really different from all these other
Yeah,
activities that
yeah.
you listed, but
Right.
that
Right.
there
Yeah.
would be like less of a mental
Yeah.
distinction between
Right.
like, oh, like so and so is unemployed, even though maybe he does a lot of like political activism and volunteering. Like right now, that's
Yeah.
still like this very stark
Right.
division.
Right.
But it wouldn't have to be like that.
Right.
Right. Is that kind? I mean, that's sort of
Yeah, right. And I think in a world
sense.
where people didn't need a salary,
Right.
but they still wanted to do stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
If
And
you
then-
had a project that that
Yeah.
was the kind of thing that now you would hire people and give them a salary for,
Right.
Right.
you might be able to get people to put that kind of
Right.
energy in
Right.
Definitely.
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
because it's fun.
Exactly.
They don't
And,
need a
and the
salary,
question,
yeah.
what do you do,
Right.
then becomes actually about what you do,
Right.
and not where
Right.
you work and who's your employer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or even maybe there are a lot of fun options for a particular person. Like, oh, I would want to do any of these really fun things, but maybe one guy offers to throw in $50 or
Right.
something.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, that's not going to meet minimum wage requirements if it's like $50 for a month of work or something like that. But it seems like something that would be totally reasonable in a world where people had that freedom.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like how, I don't know, I like your perspective a lot, Alex, obviously, because I'm living with you all the time. But
Surprise!
but just reframing all these things that we do as kind of like a symptom of trying to like put the government's responsibility sort of onto the companies, which is sort of directly diametrically opposed to the natural rhythm of how companies work. Right, like in the
Right.
sense that companies only survive if they're profitable, more profitable than other companies. So it's like kind of directly working against that grain all the time to say, and you're the ones responsible for like health insurance and making sure people have enough money and
Yeah.
you know making sure they're not badly treated and have an
Yeah.
interesting life. And
Yeah.
like, none of that is really working well with the way that like a company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think there's some workers' rights stuff that's really important. But it has to
Yeah.
do with kind of the level of the contract, right? Like,
Right, I agree.
if
I'm
you're
not saying nothing.
an astronaut and you're going to the moon, you know you might die in that job,
Right.
right? But if it's another kind of job and they're promising a certain level of safety and then they violate
Yeah,
that,
that's really bad.
then that's a violation of the contract, of
Right.
the labor contract.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't
Totally.
want to say
Yeah.
like employers can get away with whatever they want, but we
No,
want
no,
to
that's
treat
not.
them like
That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Yeah.
bring up
And
that.
I think that
Yeah.
like information issues, for example, as you point out, like you need to be able to make an informed decision as a potential worker,
right.
for
Yeah.
sure. But I guess I was talking more about things that you think of as the government's responsibility, like
Yeah.
like basic income and healthcare and stuff.
Yeah, basic income and healthcare are two of the really big ones. Yeah.
What do you mean? The basic income and health care are not connected at this particular time? I mean,
No, but I guess
yeah.
I'm we're
So-
thinking of both as things that like are best handled by the government.
So there-
but that get
Oh,
kind of
yeah,
put
okay.
on the
Yeah, yeah,
company
yeah.
as if it's like
Right.
You know, the
So
There-
income on the company, not basic.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, there are
that's
certain
right.
certain forms of infrastructure and services that are most efficiently provided by a central government,
Yeah.
and healthcare is one of them, or health insurance is one of them, and then another one is just providing people with the money to activate the markets.
Yeah, no,
Right,
I
yeah.
thought that you would connect basic income and health care with working. You meant
Right.
Oh, no,
income.
I
You
just
meant
meant
just
income.
income.
Yeah, I just
no,
meant
I was
Right,
just
right, right.
saying,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And I think that the fact that we're doing that is a symptom of the fact that we're not doing it correctly. The fact that
Yeah.
that we
Yeah.
force employers to provide health insurance and that we force them to provide incomes to people too.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
What about the influence on immigration with minimum wage?
With in terms of there being a black market of laborers who are working below minimum wage,
Like
or
with Trump, there's a big controversy with him
oh
hiring all these.
Below minimum wage.
Mhm.
yeah, I mean if you eliminate minimum wage, then there's no such thing as hiring anyone below minimum wage. So that kind of eliminates that whole problem. but you'd still have to ask the question of who do we give the basic income
Yeah.
to, right? Because if you're only giving basic income to citizens and then
Right.
there are non-citizens living and working here, that can create a problem as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. That
Yeah.
would be kind of the same thing we're talking about, like where those people wouldn't have much bargaining power if
Right.
they didn't get a basic
Yeah.
income. So then
Yeah.
they would be taking like jobs for whatever pay they would give
Yeah.
and that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Right. Which
And-
is what's happening now. I mean,
Yeah, which
really,
is also happening
yeah,
now. But
yeah.
even
Yeah.
without the
Yeah.
minimum wage, if you had a basic income instead, you'd have that problem.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and that's why I generally advocate giving it to non-citizens as well.
Yeah.
That's kind of a whole separate topic, but yeah, I mean, like in an ideal world, we have a global basic income that goes to
Yeah.
everyone and that kind of thing. Yeah. So Rick asked the question. I had said we have the resources to do that, so that means pay people a basic income. And he said, "Who is we?" So when I say we have the resources to support a basic income, to productively respond to that level of consumer spending, I mean kind of the economy as a whole. Like the economy has a certain productive capacity, but we're not going to produce what consumers don't have the money to buy. Businesses are not going to make things that they can't sell to people. So if you put money in all consumers' hands, in every consumer's hands, then all of the people and firms and everything that have the resources to produce things for those consumers at a profit are going to compete for that money. The consumer spending is what activates the markets. So when I say that the economy has the resources to provide, or for us to provide people with a basic income, that means that that I know that we can activate more of those businesses. We can activate more of those resources if only people had the money to buy this stuff.
Right. And
Yeah.
I guess I was just going to add, if you're looking at this sort of at the level of the country, then it's obviously going to be different levels of basic income for different countries. Like we talked about, Venezuela would be
Right.
very low or whatever, versus like the United States could be a lot higher at this point.
Right. I tend to view like basic income as something that kind of makes sense in any country, but the optimal level is going to correspond with whatever that economy's capacity is to provide things with consumers, whatever the physical capacity is, what resources they have, what they're able to import from other countries, and all of that kind of combined. Yeah.
It's a really consumer-oriented point of view. I mean,
Yeah.
the other point of view could be that build it and they will come. I mean that.
Yeah, that's called Say's law.
What?
Jean-Baptiste Say. It's the if you build it, they will come law.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Supply creates its own demand.
Right. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, you're so completely on the other side of that.
Yeah, and that's because it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is that in order for that to work, prices would have to be able to adjust downward across the entire economy. So in other words, if you produce all the stuff, if your economy produces all the stuff
Right.
and nobody's buying it, then you keep having to lower the
Yes.
price until everyone buys it.
Right.
And that might be true in an individual market.
Yep.
But it can't be true in the overall economy, because if it's true in the overall economy, then you have deflation. And then you don't have a stable currency anymore. Markets aren't able to work efficiently. Individual markets aren't able to work efficiently because they need a stable standard unit of value in which to set prices. So we use monetary policy to prevent that from happening. We don't allow prices to decrease across the entire economy. So supply, because of that, because we need a stable currency, supply can't create its own demand. You have to ensure that people have the money to buy the stuff, because the average prices of everything aren't going to be coming down.
So they won't come.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm thinking about it.
I guess it was during the
Yeah.
Depression that people started to question this more, right?
Yeah.
I think you told me that, didn't you? Or am I getting that wrong?
People have questioned it at various times, but the depression was a big one, and that's when John Maynard Keynes was around, and he put forward the idea of, well, you need to activate the demand in order for the economy to be supplying.
Instead of the supply.
So that's
activating the demand.
If you talk about like Keynesianism and stuff, like a lot of that is demand activation. So it's exactly what I'm talking about.
Right.
Except the problem with Keynes was that he was still talking about jobs. He was talking about how do you get the economy to full employment?
Right.
How do you minimize involuntary unemployment, that kind of stuff.
In order to activate the supply, there has to be demand. So you have to get So
Right.
I mean,
But he said he was basically
read all
saying-
the economic stuff,
Right.
but I'm just doing this by
He was basically saying we need to create
Intuition.
jobs for people,
Right.
get them employed. Now they have incomes, and those incomes can sustain the productive economy,
Right,
and that will
right,
activate
yeah.
the supply.
right.
But the problem was the jobs part, right? All you had to do was say, give the people the incomes,
Right.
and then whatever jobs are necessary to produce the stuff will be created by the businesses.
Right.
And if they don't need to create jobs, then that's great. Fewer people have to work, right? So I would say that that's probably one of Keynes's biggest mistakes, is to be focusing on jobs. Yeah. And that started, that was the beginning of macroeconomics. So this kind of assumption that jobs are the way that consumers get their incomes is kind of baked into all of our macroeconomic models. So if you ask a macroeconomist, how does basic income affect the economy, in kind of like a theoretical, in terms of like how their model would explain it, they can't really explain it because their model is designed around people getting incomes from their jobs,
Right.
around the labor market fulfilling that
And
role.
that's so primal, though, Alex.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a basic. It's not just about a model that allows the economy to work a certain way. I mean, it's hunter-gatherer and people needing this
Sure.
to work, or this intuition anyway that they have to do something in order to get something. I mean, that's a really basic belief.
But even like hunter-gatherers, I mean, people do different kinds of work. Like,
Yeah.
people who are staying home, like raising children, and nobody's like, well, you didn't like come and hunt and gather, so you don't get any food.
Right.
They're like, oh yes, you were doing important work
No,
of
that
like
came later.
raising the
Yeah,
children.
that came
and
later.
so
But
people's-
the idea of something from nothing is a really big hurdle for a lot of people to get over, especially in America.
Well, yeah,
Very-
that's
really
true. I'm
based
just, I'm
on-
just disputing this.
Yeah, right,
That,
the
like,
hunter-gatherer
it's always
thing.
been
I don't
that
think
way.
our
like
current-
the Puritan view is, work. I mean, I grew up in a working class family. It was very
Right.
big work ethic.
Yeah.
It wasn't even a question.
Right.
What are you going to do? How are you going to live? How do you
Right.
earn your money?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
it
not
was-
disputing that it's very baked in.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
really
just
baked in.
disputing the idea that early people necessarily had it baked in. I don't think they did.
Yeah, different.
Yeah,
different
different way.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, but I think they'd get mad if somebody's just lying around not doing anything, and they still
I
got
mean,
the
but
benefit
it's
of other
only
people's
because
work.
They had to do but they would only be upset because it's like, oh well, I had to do work,
Right.
And so then it
Right.
feels unfair.
That's
if,
right.
Like, if berries and steak like fell from the sky, I
Right.
don't think that they would be like,
That's
well, I went to the river and got some fish.
that's
and you
a
just-
great example because that's like basic income because
Yeah.
everybody's getting something, nobody's resentful. I mean, that's really what you're saying too. And
yeah. I mean,
that poor rich divide suddenly doesn't seem as sharp.
yeah. I mean, I think people will feel resentful of the lazy if they feel like they have to work to get the same thing
Right,
that the lazy
right,
person
yes.
got without working.
Yes.
Right.
But
And that's.
if having some, oh sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and that wouldn't be the case with basic income because everyone gets the
Right.
basic income,
Yeah.
and you're only working because you want something on top of it.
Right.
Yeah.
I was also just going to say, like, you would reframe that as like, some people are actually taking resources from the economy by working a job that doesn't need to be worked, that they have to commute to. And
Oh,
that
yeah.
takes
Yeah,
up
yeah.
resources.
It's-
So it's actually
Yeah.
like net negative is the point that Alex makes about like unnecessary jobs.
It's incredibly wasteful. So I mean, like you could ask, the question came up is how do people have meaning and purpose in their lives? Maybe for some people, the answer is to make up jobs for them to do, useless jobs to everyone else, and force them to do those jobs. But that takes resources. That's more expensive than not creating that activity for them to do, right? So it's still, even in today's economy, it takes resources. It's just we morally kind of frame it as the person doing something useful and earning something, right? That's just kind of how we frame it. But it's still expensive for our economy. It's still wasteful.
That's just so hard to see
Yeah.
because it's like such a diffuse thing. It's hard, like you've even pointed out, it's hard to know which jobs are like that or to what
Right.
degree. And like, it's
We
like,
can't know
we
until
don't
until
know.
we bring the economy up
Right.
to its full potential and see what jobs are left.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Rick says, who is the economy as a whole? It's essentially taking from the rich and giving to the poor, isn't it? And if the poor just buys from the rich again, then rinse and repeat. So no, it's not taking from the rich because you're not taking anything from the rich. You are giving money to consumers for them to spend, and then the rich are just getting it and accumulating it, right? They accumulate wealth. They're not going to accumulate it in the form of cash. They're not going to have piles of cash. but they're going to be turning that money
Scrooge McDuck pools.
into other investment instruments. It could be stocks and bonds. It could even be treasury securities, stuff like that.
Howard Hughes is kind of like that.
Yeah. So,
Howard Hughes. Oh,
but I mean, you can imagine Howard Hughes or Scrooge McDuck and people sitting on piles of cash, and that comparison wouldn't be entirely inaccurate.
I was just going to say,
Inaccurate is
that's kind of a
inaccurate.
good image for you in terms of the money not using up resources in the economy. If someone's
Right.
just swimming in it.
They're just swimming in it, sitting on a pile of it. It doesn't affect the economy. You don't need to tax it away because it's not being spent into the productive economy. They're just accumulating the wealth. So it's not a problem. It's just, I like to tell people that money doesn't circulate in the economy. It flows in a direction. It starts with consumers and it goes to the producers, and then it kind of ends up with rich people,
It sounds like Rick
Yeah.
is kind of agrees with that idea of the flow of it.
He was talking about taking from the rich and giving to the poor,
Oh,
and
I
I don't think there's that mechanism in there.
Giving to them.
Oh, no, you get to get into like how we print money.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Their choice is where does the money come
Yeah,
from?
yeah.
Giving to them, right?
The
Giving to
inevitable
them,
question.
Copying all of Alex's greatest hits
Exactly.
today.
Yeah.
giving to them from the economy as a whole, and it's not from the rich, and it's not from them. Not clear where money is coming from, right?
Yeah.
So the
Good
government
question,
can the way I like to think about the government spending money is anytime they spend money, they're issuing new money into the economy, and what matters is whether the economy has room for that money, whether there's going to be something produced in response to that money, and if there is, then the government can spend. The constraint on government spending is not, some kind of tax revenue or something like that. At least from an economics perspective, it's not tax revenue. Of course, we have rules in place where the government's supposed to balance their budget and that kind of thing. But as we see in the real world, even the government is often not balancing its budget and spending more than they're taxing, which is totally fine and totally sustainable as long as the money has somewhere to go in the economy. So I think when you're asking where does the money come from, that's the wrong question. The question should be, does the money have somewhere to go? And if yes, then you can spend. Then the government can spend. And in terms of the mechanisms of what that looks like behind the scenes, the government is going to be issuing treasury securities and selling those onto the open market. But then if there are too many on the open market, then the Fed comes in and buys them and takes them onto their own balance sheet. But all of these complicated mechanisms aside, what it all boils down to is the government printing money. Anytime they spend money into the economy, they're printing money. Anytime they tax money out of the economy, they are destroying money from that part of the economy. And there's no one-to-one correspondence between destroying money in one part of the economy, like I was saying before, and creating money into another part of the economy. So as long as there's room for money to be spent in the economy, you can spend money into the economy. That's kind of the answer.
This is Alex's.
Yeah, you can tell I've gone through this
Yes.
kind of spiel before. Yeah,
But very important background to a lot of the other stuff that you say.
yeah.
Do you have quotes for us?
I have quotes. Let's get into the article. Yeah, so see if we've covered all of it. So right now we are living through the most supply-restricted wage market since the 1970s. There just aren't extra workers available. In the U.S., there are 6.7 million job openings, but only 6.3 million people looking for work, according to the most recent government numbers.
Okay,
So,
this is where
yeah.
my complaint comes in, because then after this he points out that many people are only working part-time and are happy to pick up more work. So this is just
Right.
false.
So
Then
when he
it is
says
not a supply-restricted wage market.
right, so when he says there just aren't extra workers available,
False.
there are plenty of extra workers
He
available.
says it
They're just
right
already
below.
working.
He
Right.
says
Yes.
it right below. Same article.
He's so mad about
I'm
it.
so mad about it.
And another important thing to keep in mind is a job opening does not mean that you need that labor or something like that.
Right.
If I'm a business, I might create 10,000 job openings that are all like, yeah, we're going to make the wage really low and make the requirements really high. And if we did get that person at that
Right.
wage, that would be great. But we're just going to leave this open out there in case
Right.
someone comes along at some point, and that would be fantastic, right? Like you can create as many job openings as you want. That has nothing to do with,
Right.
the supply of labor being tight or the demand for labor being high or something like that. You could have 500 times as many job openings as there are now, and that would say nothing about the demand for labor.
I would also say that that he doesn't address another issue you talked about in here, which is like people, whether they classify themselves as looking for work or not. Like whether they just give up or like don't
Yeah.
say that they're looking for work and then they're not considered unemployed.
Right.
But maybe some of those people, I don't know the details on this, but maybe some of those people would be willing to take a job as well, which would
Yeah.
also mean that there's a more labor supply than these numbers are suspecting.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know anything about that, Alex, but I think it's come up in here before.
So
that
what's-
like more people are classifying themselves as not looking for work, who are in the
Right.
this sort of demographic that usually
So-
would have been.
So the labor force participation rate is, for a
Yeah.
while there, it was at multi-decade lows. It was like the lowest it had been since the 1970s. It's actually crept back up a little bit since then. So,
Okay.
yeah.
But that's a factor here too, because if some of those people are willing to work, even if they're classifying themselves as like not looking, then
Right.
those people are also part of the labor supply. And probably
they're
all
part
of
of the
those
labor
people
force,
at
yeah.
a certain wage would be willing to work. Like
Yeah.
$1 million an hour, they're probably
Yeah.
going to work. So like
Yeah,
they're
everyone-
sort of
yeah.
still part of the supply, I think.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, there's...
So he should have addressed maybe that too.
Yeah, but it's interesting also because there are a lot of people looking at these statistics kind of superficially. Like you read articles on CNBC and they're like, oh, there's so many job openings and only so many people are unemployed. Why aren't we seeing inflation? That kind of stuff. But it's really, like none of this should be surprising or controversial or anything. It's just, like this is not the information that's gonna tell us about wages.
Well, I think he had a point to make, which is like maybe that the prevalence of part-time work makes these numbers not as reflective as they used to be.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Yeah, so maybe there was a time when these numbers meant something more.
That's why people are surprised, right? Because there's a statistical relationship in the past, he was claiming.
Yeah. I guess maybe it shouldn't be too surprising that people are surprised. Yeah.
But,
Yeah. But it's not surprising to us. Yeah. Okay.
I'm wondering why there's a focus on wages aren't going up. If there's so much employment, why then aren't we seeing an increase in wages? I don't even understand why people see that relationship.
Look, that was the point I was making about bargaining power. So in the past, when let's imagine that.
So remember when you said what if there aren't enough waitresses?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you can just pay them more to get more waitresses, right? So if you're imagining a scenario in which there aren't enough workers in the overall economy.
Right, but it isn't full employment. I mean, it's not like it's full employment, but they're saying the more employment there is.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
The higher the wages
Yeah,
go, because
okay.
there's
Yeah,
more
yeah.
of a scarcity of
Right,
people.
yeah.
That's what he means by the supply and demand. Supply of labor, demand for labor.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so it looks like there should be low supply of labor relative to demand because the unemployment numbers are low.
Right.
But that hides the fact that a lot of those people are only working part-time.
Right,
in the
which
gig
is the
economy
point
and
in
so
that
on.
article, yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Although he doesn't really tie it in that way.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I'm really upset about it. I think he's more confusing than he needs to be. That's what I was
Yeah, it was
saying.
very choppy to
Yeah,
read.
yeah. I don't
Like,
think
there's
he
a
was
point,
very
there's a
good.
point, there's a point.
It might not have been the best article to pick.
Sorry, babe.
Yeah.
But it
kind
did
of-
touch on a lot of
We have fun
Yeah.
critiquing it.
He kind of linked to a bunch of
Exactly.
other different articles that are maybe better written but more narrow in their scope.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's the next one. We're skipping around a bit here. In that context, the minimum wage suddenly becomes the most important political issue for workers. It's the only way to get a raise in an economy that does not create full-time jobs or jobs with regular pay
What do you have
increases.
to say about that, Alex? Is it the only way?
Prompt.
So, yes, there's a reason why I chose this quote. Because I have a feeling that it's not the only way. So, yeah, I mean, people need money, not jobs. And it's especially like the idea that you can, this will somehow help with part-time jobs. It doesn't really add up. If people are working varying amounts of time, then the only way to ensure that everyone gets a raise or gets more income is through something that's not tied to the labor itself.
What is in that context referred to?
It kind of refers to the previous quote, but it also refers to this paragraph. It's talking about the gig economy. The obvious function of the so-called gig economy is to create inequality.
What? That's the function.
The unemployed
Doesn't make sense.
The unemployed now barely exist. In their places are millions of people stuck in jobs that offer too few hours to get by or jobs that don't come with a career ladder offering pay advancement. So,
It's only the obvious result of the gig economy is creating inequality. I feel like it's a more accurate
Oh,
opening to that
result
paragraph.
versus function.
right, the obvious result maybe, not the obvious function. Like that's what it's
We
for.
wanted to create some
Someone
inequality.
said, yeah, it's like let's
like
let's have a
intention.
gig economy.
Yeah,
We want
yeah,
more
right.
inequality. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a funny way
But
of
yeah,
phrasing it.
there's a reason why I didn't pick that paragraph. Just
Yeah.
because it,
Yeah, it's confusing.
Second jobs that are over a few hours. Okay.
So-
and then the minimum wage suddenly becomes. I don't know if that that doesn't follow though. The most important political issue, it seems to me, would not then be the minimum wage, but the existence of too many part-time jobs and not enough full-time jobs, or
Right, because I'm not even sure that those part-time jobs pay below or
right. And even if they did, you were saying earlier, Alex, so you get 2 hours of work and at minimum wage.
Right.
That doesn't help.
right, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, especially with something like Uber, if it gets more expensive, people use it less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So now there's fewer people getting hours from that anyway.
Although, I mean,
Yeah.
some of the argument around, like, stuff like Uber is that, like, the CEOs could, like, subsidize that. They could be like, perhaps I do not
Oh,
need, like,
I see, right.
to make, like, $8 million, like, perhaps I could fill in some of that gap.
Yeah, I
is-
see.
Is some of the argument.
That makes sense. Yeah. I don't know enough econ to know how that works, but that's a good point.
Yeah, I think that's, like, the current, like, Uber Lyft strike is people being, like, we're not getting paid enough, but, like, Uber Lyft are still posting these high profits. And so that,
Right.
given the non-basic income world that we live in, like, seems very unfair to be like, some people are profiting off of my labor, but I am not
Right.
profiting off of my labor.
Yeah. I
Have
agree.
have Uber and Lyft even made a profit yet?
No,
No.
not by lunch.
Yeah.
I mean, they're like heavily subsidized by angel investors, basically.
Right.
Because it's true. Like and
So
the way
they're
it
not
started,
even
they'd be
making
like
a profit.
posting losses, but still being like ridiculous.
This is why they're so great for the consumer.
Right.
Nobody's making out except the consumer right now, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody's making out good except the consumer.
Yeah,
if they're
right.
not making
Yeah.
a profit and the
That's
workers
true.
aren't being paid that
Yeah,
much,
well, we
then,
can just
Yeah.
call Uber.
but that's why
Easy.
we love Uber so much because it is.
Yeah.
cheap.
Yeah, those two
But yeah,
paragraphs
makes sense.
don't tie together very well.
So I think it ties better to the previous paragraph I highlighted.
Yeah.
But another reason why I highlighted this paragraph is because it says the most important political issue for workers, and it's just frustrating to me that people think
Right.
of themselves as workers, like that's who they are, and then we think of people as workers.
Yeah, and it leaves out everybody
Yeah.
else too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like unconsciously the idea is that it's okay to leave out everybody else
Yeah.
because they're not worth anything because
Right.
they're not a worker.
Yeah. I know.
Yeah. Yeah, and this relates to one of Rick's questions, which was, it sounds like you're saying that maintaining the level of consumption is part of the goal. And I think this has to do with, the economy exists for the benefit of the people. So the most important role that people have in the economy is to consume that benefit. Consumption is the most important thing. That's what everything else is for. We're not producing just for the sake of producing. We're producing because, people want to consume that production. And the most important role of people in the economy and in the economy is as consumers, not as workers. Workers are there to serve the consumers. Businesses are there to serve the consumers. Everything exists to benefit the people so they can consume the benefit.
I feel like consumer is like a word that isn't like it's not the best. Like it's the best word in the sense that that's how we use it. But at the same time, people have strange connotations with
Yeah,
it.
they do.
I almost think like the benefactors.
Like consumerism.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like I feel like the benefactors of it.
Yeah.
Or not? Is it benefactor or the benefitees?
Beneficiaries.
Beneficiaries. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, beneficiaries
That's a better word.
captures it better for me, or like might
Yeah.
capture it more clearly for me.
Yeah. Consumer sounds.
Right.
It's tough because consumer is the word that economists use
I know,
and
they do,
talk
yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
But I
So
think-
when we talk
yeah.
about like the level of consumption in the economy, if you say the level of benefiting in the economy or
But
something.
that's really
yeah.
what you mean, because people
Yeah.
think consumption, they think people being like tricked into buying things they don't really enjoy, or like using up too many natural resources. Those are kind of the associations that come to mind.
Which is a bad.
Right, consumerism, materialism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When really, what you're saying is just like
Right.
the economy exists to benefit people,
Right.
Yeah.
and we're the people who are supposed to benefit from the economy,
Right.
and that really frames it differently. Like
Right.
same
Which
as
is a
we're supposed
really
to have a government to
kind of a
benefit
neat
from that
idea.
government.
Pretty radical to think about it that way. Yeah.
Right.
Very provocative.
Yeah. So anyway, but I find people getting tripped up by this word. a
Yeah.
lot, like the way that
Another word that trips people up is efficiency.
that doesn't trip me up. As
Doesn't
much,
trip you up? Does
Why?
it trip you up?
But
Elizabeth?
well, because it has there's this, so I'm get, like so my intuition is that the idea is like that like efficiency is that somehow we're stripping like every like human benefiting thing out of.
Mm.
This,
Right.
like like a super efficient economy is one where we can like exploit like if Jared
I
we
see.
have a lot of feelings about like exploiting
Right.
like laborers. I mean like okay like how can we get the most labor out of workers
Right.
and like keep all
Right.
of that and like not
Right.
do anything good for the workers or for
Right.
society as a whole.
Interesting,
Like we're
yeah.
not gonna
Right.
waste any money
Yeah.
on
Right.
having like air conditioning in your factory in the summer because that's inefficient.
I see.
Like we're just
Right.
we're just trying to make profit.
Right.
The business is only about making profit. It's not about
Right.
benefiting
Yeah.
anyone else in any way.
But there's a study that says that people who are overheated are 13% less efficient.
That makes sense.
There you go.
Yeah.
I guess the association I have with efficiency is more like what most people might have with like efficient use of energy in your home. Like we're trying to like not, we can all benefit more if we don't have like unnecessary waste, which depends on how you think about
I
necessary.
mean, these are all examples of efficiency. So maybe
Yeah.
you are not providing air conditioners, and now you're more efficiently using resources in your factory or something like that. But if we talk about an efficient economy, I think of how do we provide the most benefit to people with the least waste.
Right. Yeah, that's kind
Yeah.
of what I think about it too.
Yeah.
The other
But
hand, the
not a
Walmart
good
example, it's more efficient to have Walmart come in and siphon off the
Yeah.
local economies. It's more efficient, but then there are these independent mom and pop stores, independent bookstores. People are there too.
So,
But then,
that's
the
not
question,
benefit.
but then the question is, what's the value? Like, because if the value is only like, oh, like those mom and pop people are now unemployed, then in the basic income world, it's like, but they have a basic income, and that's fine.
Well, yeah.
If the value is like, oh, well, the mom and pop independent bookstore like hosts like local author events and like has all these great things, and your like Amazon warehouse is super impersonal and just has weird, creepy algorithms that like stalk your Facebook feed to like make suggestions to you. Then the mom and pop store has a real value add, and in the basic income world, people might be like, I don't want Amazon to like have all of my information, and they seem really impersonal, and like I really love like Sally and Sue who like run that independent bookstore,
And actually, they are
and
coming
like they
back.
have great taste in authors,
Yeah,
and like
yeah,
they always
true.
give recommendations for my kids.
Yeah, I
and-
think that's right.
so yeah, I
Talking
mean,
about the connotations of efficiency,
right.
some of the negative
So
connotations.
if consumers have the income and they have the freedom to choose what they want to do with their time and how they want to spend their money, then they may very well choose the local bookstore.
Yeah, bookstores
And
are coming back
that's
anyway.
fine.
Yeah.
So that's and that's something that's made possible by basic income.
Right.
But if that bookstore was serving no other purpose than being a bookstore and Amazon is better in every way,
Right.
then maybe you don't need that bookstore in your
Right,
community.
And that's more
And people
efficient.
won't choose
No.
to
Yeah.
have that bookstore in their
Right.
community.
I understand.
Right.
But that then puts them out of business, which is a people thing too.
Right. Well, I guess one thing that I think about as a resource, especially after talking to Alex for so long, is people's time. And like if those people are working in the store because they have to work in the store because that's how they make their money, and like
Right.
they're just wasting their time from the point of view of the broader society. That's a loss as well for me. Like if one, or like think about farming, like think of all the things we can do because we don't have to all farm anymore.
Right.
I mean, it's just the same kind of shift.
No, I understand. I'm just thinking about the individual impact of some of this stuff,
Right.
some of the efficiency that's going on, and that's going to be going on. I
Right,
mean, it's going
right.
on and going on, and has to do with automation too.
Yeah.
And yes,
Well,
efficiency, but
like a few years ago, Amazon bought a pharmacy company, and recently CVS has been closing up their pharmacies because Amazon. It seems like they're going to start delivering their.
oh really?
Oh, cool.
So you don't have to go to a mile away or whatever
Right.
to the CVS anymore.
Right.
They can just deliver it to you like they do with everything else.
That's pretty cool.
Great.
Yeah, see?
Right.
You benefit as the
Well, I
consumer.
benefit,
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I like to think about, if consumers do have spending money, then it aligns the incentive of the firm, like the profit motives of the firms, with the benefit of the consumers. The way to make money is to sell things that the consumers want to give you money for.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think, when we worry about mom and pop stores closing down and stuff like that, we're worried about a few different things. And in a world with basic income, the stores that close down are going to be the stores that people don't need.
Well, yeah, in that world, but that's not the world that's happening right now. I'm just talking about efficiency,
Yeah.
the connotations of that word right now.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
That
mean,
makes
I
sense.
know that
Yeah.
there's a gap between what's happening now and what
I
will
would say
happen.
that the fact that people have less access to the things they want now is inefficient
Yeah,
with respect to the overall economy,
right.
even if it's efficient with respect to maybe some of the individual businesses involved.
Right,
Yeah.
I do think like there's always losses too. Like I mean, if you're invested in that store and then the world no longer needs that
Yeah.
store, that's
Yeah.
just kind of like part of how
Yeah.
things go. I guess.
Identity
Yeah.
thing, totally.
Yeah, and there
especially
are some
for
people.
older people in rural areas, the little general store by the gas station, all that
Right.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, or maybe you're a peanut farmer and that's all you know, and then the peanut farming robot comes along or whatever.
Yeah, right.
Like the
Yeah.
John Henry song.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's yet to be, the effects of that are yet to be fully felt. That's happening now. I mean, it has been happening, but
Yeah. So then the question is, how do you? What's the best way to ensure that these people still have meaningful lives, are
Right.
still happy?
Right.
Do we have them farm peanuts even though we don't need them to?
Right.
let
Maybe
them do whatever
that's
they
the
want.
answer.
They have a basic income.
Well, there's a difference between right. There are
If
some
they have a basic,
there are some people who maybe you let them do whatever they want and then they're not happy.
right?
Right. So we have to but I think by default, giving people the freedom and giving people the money is the way we should go.
Yeah.
And then if people are struggling to thrive, then we can intervene and figure out how to support them in other ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just don't see it as that easy.
No. Yeah. I mean.
It's not. It's a challenge, but I think it's an exciting challenge because it's a challenge that we'll be facing because we've solved these other problems.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Like in Star Trek, the John Picard's brother has a vineyard, and there's Synthahol, and you don't need the vineyard anymore.
Oh yeah. Right. Exactly.
What is it called? Synthahol?
Synthahol.
They're-
Synthetic
like, you can
alcohol.
just
Oh,
have
there
it in
actually
the
is
replicator.
Synthahol being produced now. It's
Yeah.
something like it.
Really?
Mhm.
Huh.
Yeah, but I mean, like we even have that now, like people brewing their own beer for fun, or like I don't know,
Yeah.
doing things by hand,
right.
and
'Cause,
you know,
yeah, craftsmen,
that kind of thing is
artisan.
cool, yeah.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that
Right.
before.
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
like that
Yeah.
in like an age of automation, that there's something like that then is really valuable about
Right.
like handcrafted
Right.
yeah, exactly,
stuff.
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
There is that we've seen that since the Industrial Revolution. We were talking about that last time.
Yeah, because then like having like handcrafted stuff becomes a luxury item.
Exactly.
Like,
Right,
instead of,
right.
like being like, oh, like
Right.
you know, you see a luxury like, oh, like you have a machine to do
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
Like, machines
yeah,
are expensive
right.
and hard to maintain. And now it's
Exactly.
like, oh, like you could pay a person
Exactly.
to do that. People are like expensive to maintain. Like,
Exactly.
that's-
It becomes like its own. It becomes the costly signal a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
So Rick has another comment. He says, "Do you really think people know what they want? They are told what they want, and nonstop, rampant consumerism is not sustainable. Happiness through consumption is fleeting." So, I think this comes back to kind of our question of how we're defining consumption, right? Certainly, if you are tricking people into buying things that they
I
don't
think
really
he's
need.
talking about advertising.
Yeah, I'm talking about advertising too.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're tricking people into buying things they don't really need, then that is a problem. So, you know, in terms of what's sustainable and what's not, we have to look at the resources. So we put a lot of resources right now into you know, forcing people to work. You know, there's a lot of externalities to people commuting and, you know, carbon emissions and all that kind of stuff that come along with rush hour and all of that. And, you know, I mean,
Yeah. It's interesting. Like, I think this kind of comes under. Oh, were you still going? Did I go?
you can go ahead.
I think this kind of comes under your umbrella of what you're just talking about too, with like, once you have a basic income in your frame, you sort of see what other problems you feel are still there, and
Yeah.
maybe people being like unhappy in the long run, or like you know, feeling like there's or you know, unsustainable use of resources obviously factors in how you think about how the level
Right.
of the basic income could be, but also like, yeah, I guess if you're concerned about the social culture that maybe could be addressed separately.
Yeah, and if we have a problem with advertising and wastefulness of resources in the economy, we still want to address those. And basic income does not address those on its own. It solves the specific problem of how to get spending money to consumers, which is something that we know we need, that we're kind of solving through these, or trying to solve through these other ways like minimum wage and job creation and stuff like that.
Like right now, companies spend far more on advertising than they do on R&D.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So you don't really, and then like they bribe like doctors to prescribe like OxyContin and things like that. And like there was a story on Last Week Tonight a few weeks ago about how this one pharmacy has like 5 million prescriptions of OxyContin and things, but there are only like 400 people in the town.
It's not really funny, but it's like, I saw that. That was crazy. So I mean, I think there's like different things that come to mind with Rick, your question, and I don't know which one you're focusing on, maybe both. But one is the sustainability, like in terms of natural resources. And so one thing that Alex often you talk about is like you'd set the basic income also at a level so that you're seeing somewhat sustainable use of resources, ideally, not just like using them all up right away or something like that. But also like not all consumerism, as we talk about it, is created equal with respect to natural resources, right? So like going to a class, again, my yoga class example, going to a yoga class doesn't use up as many resources as, I don't know, like burning a lot of petroleum-based heat or something like that.
Right.
So they're kind of, you could also tax specific things.
Right, and watching a movie or something like that doesn't take up very many resources, even though it's a form of consumption.
Right.
Yeah.
I think he's going back to the purpose argument there, though.
Yeah.
That happiness through consumption is fleeting.
Right, right.
I mean, I just read something about purpose being usefulness, which was an interesting
That
idea.
is interesting.
That however you can be useful is what creates the sense of happiness. The happiness itself is not a real thing.
Well,
the connection with people, the connection with purpose, all that. But so when you're buying stuff, I mean, in the article it talked about that, buying stuff gives you that fleeting sense of purposefulness and happiness, but it is very fleeting. So I think that's what it reminds me of.
It depends on what you're buying, though, too.
Well,
food makes me really happy.
Exactly.
That's what makes you happy.
Food.
Like eating, like food.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Like not starving.
Right. That makes me happy too.
Yeah.
Like being able to have like, a variety
out,
of foods I can consume.
Right.
And not
Retail therapy stuff.
But also, like I was
Yeah.
talking last time about, and this does use some natural resources, but I was talking about the kids from Europe I met who thought of travel as their purpose for a while, like learning from different cultures. They were traveling pretty cheaply, but like that's a way to spend money.
Right, and
that can be very meaningful for people.
Yeah.
I agree.
Or taking classes or...
And I think it's important to remember that I think most of the people in this room, and probably most of the people watching this video, your job and your career is something that feels meaningful to you, or for a lot of people it is. But for, I think, even more people, it's not.
It's not, yeah, exactly.
It's something that feels, it's something that feels really miserable.
Yeah.
And maybe you get a sense of purpose out of it, but the sense of purpose comes from the fact that you pushed yourself to do something really hard and grueling and, that kind of thing.
Dirty, dull, and dangerous.
Yeah.
Dirty, dull, and dangerous.
Nice.
The 3Ds.
The 3Ds.
That's what they call it in Japan.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so I think the answer to providing people with purpose and usefulness is probably not to make them do the work that they're currently doing, because the work that they're currently doing is not designed around activating those fulfillment instincts of a human person.
It's not
right?
optimized to that.
It's not optimized to that.
Right.
Whereas
So
sorry.
So I mean, I like to say there are a lot of problems that basic income does not solve, and I think this is one of them, but it can open up the opportunity for us to figure out how to solve it.
Yeah.
Figure out how to get people
right.
more meaning and purpose in their lives. So happiness through consumption is fleeting. It depends what you mean. If we mean consumption in the broad sense of being the beneficiary of the amazing things that the economy has to offer, that's that's not necessarily fleeting. I mean, you eat food and then you're hungry again later. You might call that fleeting, but it's also
better than beats the alternative.
it's also living, right? Like you're having experiences, and
living,
each
exactly.
experience might be fleeting, but
Right.
you string those together, and that's a life.
It's also they have a. It says something in Munich, the movie with Spielberg.
It's a good one.
Why cut your
What's it
nails
called?
when you just
Munich.
when you're just
yeah.
going to have to cut them again later? Then he's like referring to terrorists
Right.
because your nail. The nail is like the. Well, there's another example. Like a few years ago, well, I guess it's like 12 or something like that. There was a really ineffective Al Qaeda leader who was running the program, and then they killed him off, and now there's this really effective one that took his place.
That's interesting. I guess one last little thought I have on this, just because it's kind of interesting, is like the basic income is the same amount that goes to everybody,
Right.
and the kind of consumerism that people often feel is the most. I don't know if this is true, but feel is like the most dissatisfying is like costly signaling kinds of things. I think
Like showing
things,
off.
things that kind of show off your wealth, but costly signaling functions to show off your relative position, and basic income does nothing to change that. So it shouldn't really have much of an effect on costly signaling per se, because it's even across
Right.
everybody.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
So just a thought on
Yeah.
consumerism that way.
Nick, you look like you're about to say something.
I'm trying to formulate something. Rick's question about do people know what they want
Yeah.
really hits me as
Yeah.
an important one. I mean, not in a way that makes me think, question whether basic income is a good idea or not, but just it brings to mind how it really challenges things that I think are very deeply rooted in our economy, but also
Basic
our
income challenges
culture.
those things.
Right. Yeah. And human
The question.
Yeah. Oh, the question.
Yeah.
No, having a basic
Right,
income.
right.
Like if we were to
Oh.
put in place like a generous basic income or
Yeah.
calibrated or whatever, it would be it would really disrupt things that,
Right.
certainly people who haven't thought about it much take for granted. And I think even things that we probably take for granted, it's hard to predict. And I think,
Yeah.
do people know what they want?
Yeah.
Is what they want the thing that's going to make them happy? Like a lot of times,
Right.
not so
Yeah.
Right.
not so parallel.
Right.
Right.
I think.
But
Yeah.
and I was having kind of a pessimistic thought, which is related to what you were saying, Bethany, which is like, I think one thing that really motivates a lot of people is competition,
Yeah. Status.
and that a career, it's like a way to
Right.
play a game
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
the prize is status, which is I think.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
pretty-
I think that's right.
pretty
Although I see
pretty
many
basic, yeah.
examples that are non-career examples, like video game competitions, sports competitions. Like people get good at chess. People get good at all sorts of stuff. So like, I guess the
Yeah.
neutral, not really positive or negative, but like that competition motive can find other avenues that aren't like what you're relying on for survival.
And just because there's a basic income, maybe your survival needs are taken care of, but if you're a competitive person,
Right.
that doesn't mean you're not going to still want to have a career and want to have a high-powered job for the same reason you used to have. Like, that's kind of a
Right.
separate motivation almost,
Then your
right?
basic needs, I guess.
Yeah.
This is
Right. We're still going to need
Some people working
people
anyway. Yeah.
producing
Right.
things and
Yeah, exactly.
entrepreneurs
Exactly.
starting
Yeah,
things.
exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's right.
So, So Rick says, is the goal of UBI to maintain the status quo? What does the benefit look like? More people with more free time and more people who can consume more, not addressing poverty or social ills? So I would say that, well, these are a lot of questions kind of rolled into one.
Yeah.
I would say that UBI is not about maintaining the status quo. It's about maintaining something very specific that we have not been maintaining correctly. And that's ensuring that consumers have incomes.
Right.
And then
But consumers includes all people who are currently homeless or poor and don't have much income. So like
Yeah.
it definitely addresses poverty for sure.
Right. So I would
Yeah.
say that poverty is the result, largely the result of our economy functioning incorrectly due to the lack of basic income. Many of our social ills, I would say, also fall into that boat. I'm not saying that once we have basic income in place, we won't have social problems that we'll still need to address, because I think we do. But certainly, once we've solved this, once we've addressed this very specific thing, and we have an economy that's functioning properly, that'll make it easier to kind of look at the remaining problems and kind of see where we stand and come up with an approach to addressing them. Now, in terms of what does the benefit look like? Well, the benefit looks like, we wouldn't have an economy unless it benefited people, right? There's a reason why we have one. So the benefit looks like people are able to buy food, people are able to buy clothes and things that they enjoy, and this is all consumption, yeah, but it's that's why the economy exists. And there are plenty of things that are valuable to people that they don't get by buying it through the economy, and all of that stuff is kind of its own separate thing, but the economy itself provides a very specific source of benefit to people that's actually really useful and necessary and can improve people's prosperity. So yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Well, there's an argument that when people have more money, they're more open to things, and they're more willing to accept differences in people and ideas and whatnot. But they have shorter skirts and whatever. There's a saying with that. And during the 1930s, during the Depression, they have longer skirts and whatnot.
Oh, interesting.
Right, that's true. They used to
More
measure
progressive, kind of, maybe.
the health of the economy by the length of the skirts.
Interesting.
So his experience in social ills is that giving people more money who cannot handle it only kills them quicker. So,
Yeah, we were talking
Yeah, like
about
with
that. Yeah.
Longmire, there's a segment where they received a dividend from their casino, and they started consuming all these drugs and things, and that invited all these drug dealers and things into it.
yeah, so I mean, where I like to go with comments like this is that in order for the economy to function, people need spending money, and then some people might, in that context where they have money and they have freedom, they might be using that money and freedom to harm themselves, and then we'd want to intervene. But the default should be a functioning economy where people have money. I don't think kind of proactively withholding money from people is going to get us the optimal outcomes.
I mean, I think on average, money makes people better off with diminishing returns. And that's kind of what the data shows. And of course, poverty is associated with a lot of really negative things. It doesn't mean there aren't individual cases where it's different, but...
Yeah.
And it's also the case where people are poor, so they want to get away from their reality, so they consume drugs in the first place.
So one statistic I've heard, which I haven't fact-checked, but that I read somewhere, was that like the drug use is similar among wealthier and less wealthy and poorer people, but drug addiction is stronger among poorer people. And again, I should fact check that, but that kind of relates to your point, Richard, which is like there are fewer disincentives, maybe, and more sort of proximate, at least, reasons to abuse drugs.
Yeah.
Poor person. Not that it isn't common among wealthy people too. Of course it is, but yeah.
So Rick says, is anyone here a fan of Callie Lazen and Adbusters magazine and his book Culture Jamming? Also Adam Curtis's Century of the Self special on Edward Bernays. I'm not familiar with any of these books or any of these names. Anyone know it? Anyone recognize it?
Adbusters I know, but I don't know the other one.
I've never actually read the book, but yeah.
Cool. All right, well, let's get people's final thoughts on minimum wage. Bethany.
No, I'm chewing right now.
Mom.
Final thoughts on minimum wage. I think we should have universal basic income instead.
Okay.
Okay. That's all I have
Nick.
to say.
Yeah, ditto.
Okay. Katie?
It's even more complicated than when this discussion began.
Elizabeth.
Fair. Yeah, I mean, basic income is preferable to minimum wage in a non-basic income society. I still think that minimum wage, like across the board, like is a good idea in the absence of basic income.
Yeah. Richard?
Well, we still haven't we never addressed about sort of like stagflation of people who are already earning what the minimum wage is now, and how if the minimum wage is what is introduced and is what their wages, does it going to increase or anything like that?
Bethany.
Yeah, I think that I also prefer to kind of let the full spectrum of trades happen in the wage domain and have people have a basic income that supports their bargaining power, like many other people said.
So I think Richard, to your question, there's some data that shows that when you increase the minimum wage, it also bumps up wages that are kind of near that level, but maybe by not as much. But certainly, people who are kind of on the lower edge of the wage spectrum get a little bit of a bump from an increase in the minimum wage, even if they weren't even if their wage level wasn't directly affected by the minimum wage.
Because you have to like incentivize them to take on more responsibility or something, so their job has to be like higher than minimum wage. Things like that.
So Mitchell says there should be a floor with income, however that is wages or UBI. And I would say that if we ended minimum wage right now, that would be devastating and we shouldn't do it. But it doesn't change the fact that we have things like minimum wage in place because of this fundamental thing that's missing from the economy, which is basic income. Yeah, so that's it.
Thanks, Alex.
So next week we are talking about Douglas Rushkoff, who's a guy who used to be a basic income proponent and now he's anti-basic income.
Wow.
We read one of his articles.
We read one of his articles before on the meetup about Silicon Valley, and this time we're watching a video in which he explains why he's anti-basic income. So next week,
It's on Monday.
it's on Monday. So next week our meetup is on Monday because I'm gonna be in New York with Bethany Tuesday through Thursday.
That is true.
Yes. All right.
Okay.
Thanks
thank you.
everybody.
Yay. You're gonna be in New York, but for your stuff, not your.
Yeah.
Yeah.